My name is Frederick Ade, and I am a postgraduate associate here at the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, or ELTI. ELTI is an initiative of the Yale School of the Environment focused on capacity development for conserving and restoring tropical forest landscapes. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Gillian Bloomfield, ELTI's Associate Director for Online Programs, and Abby York, ELTI's Programs Administrator. We are excited to welcome you to the last session of our four-part webinar series titled The Evolving Role of Biodiversity Credits in Global Conservation. Over the past 3 weeks, we have discussed very interesting themes concerning biodiversity credits. On April 3rd, we talked about biodiversity credits, market scope, and demands. On April 10th, we discussed biodiversity credits project design. Last week, we talked about practical considerations that inform biodiversity markets. And today, we are going to discuss monitoring and verification of biodiversity credits projects. So I would like to use this opportunity to thank my team made up of myself, Gillian Bloomfield, Abby York, and Emmy Nicholson for the hard work and efforts to make this series a success. We would also like to thank the Yale School of the Environment Master students, that is Jorge Ferrero, Nicole Israel Maya, and Sophie Roberts, who have taken time out of their busy schedules to moderate these sessions. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Sophie Roberts, a Master of Environmental Science student here at the Yale School of the Environment, to moderate today's session. Sophie?
Thank you so much, Fred, and good morning, everyone. As Fred said, my name is Sophie Roberts, and I'm a Master of Forest Science student here at Yale School of the Environment. I'm joined today by our two panelists, Dr. Florencia Montagnini and Dr. Toral Shah. Here is an outline of this session's agenda. First, you'll hear each presenter's pre-recorded talk. In order to have subtitles, prepare for variability in internet connectivity, and edit for time, our speakers kindly pre-recorded their talks. Then we'll have a live Q&A session that will follow after both presentations. Finally, we'll close with a few announcements right before 10 Eastern US time. So we have Dr. Florencia Montagnini, who's a senior research scientist at Yale University. She has over 30 years of experience researching and teaching about the sustainability of managed ecosystems in the tropics, such as forest, tree plantations, and agroforestry systems, with a special emphasis on Latin America. She received her doctorate from the University of Georgia and since 1989 has worked as a professor and researcher at Yale School of the Environment, as well as the Tropical Agriculture Research and Higher Education Center. She's written 11 books and over 250 scientific articles about the ecology of tropical forests, agroforestry systems, native species reforestation, and forest restoration. Florencia, we invite you to unmute and say hi to the audience if you'd like.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sophie, for the nice introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here during the closing session of our ELTI webinar on biodiversity credits. It's a subject, as you know, is evolving. So it was interesting when I was preparing my talk, I was thinking, because I had to record it like in advance, maybe by the time they show this video, many things have changed already. It's an evolving thing, which is great. It means it's moving. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll be happy to answer your questions at the end. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today during this ELTI webinar on biodiversity credits, and especially on this critical issue of monitoring and verification of biodiversity credit projects. And it's something that we at our school have been working on for a couple of years. And I'll tell you during the presentation who are the main colleagues and collaborators from our school and from other institutions worldwide. To motivate you, you see a few pictures in the screen where you see some natural areas, because most of biodiversity credits have been issued so far in natural areas, but some are going to be extended or are already extended to agricultural areas, and that's why you see some humans there. And a couple of birds, because birds are incredibly good monitoring indicators. So what are the procedures then? Of course, first you need to do a market review. And then what are the best methods for monitoring the components that you want to monitor? So you need to choose first a biodiversity-friendly habitat that in the case of terrazos would be their habitat banks or biodiversity units as they are called today. In agriculture, there may be agroforestry systems that are biodiversity friendly. Then you need to determine the biodiversity monitoring methods for each component, for the baseline and for the long-term monitoring to see if you're getting biodiversity gains. And as you see on the right, people doing some manual measurements of trees, and then those are the pictures that were taken with drones in Mata de Lata, where we were working with terrazos. So all kinds of technologies, remote sensing, drones, camera traps, acoustic sensors, DNA, and manual that needs to be used especially for verifying. A cost-benefit analysis for preferred methods is very important to do. And not only comparing the feasibility, the cost, meaning the dollar cost of the methods, but are they available, and then are they preferred for the particular components or not? And field verification, the third-party verifiers, that's a key issue that's still under discussion, and we're going to talk about that in a few more minutes. So comparing two biodiversity credit frameworks, just to give you an idea of what are the most frequently used components and their metrics for monitoring and verification. And you see that there is still a lack of a consensus. The choice of indicators needs much more experimentation and certification by each entity. But if you compare the Plan Vivo, and now somebody is going to talk about the Plan Vivo, so I won't go into detail with that, but it's called Nature Methodology and Data Protocol version 1, Plan Vivo 2023. They provide a list of from which to select 4 target groups, as they call them, and there are 2 required components: herbaceous plants and woody plants taller than 2 meters, and the birds. So those are the 2 main components. Habitat connectivity is part of their structural component, and they use an index that is published by Hesselbarth et al., and the reference is down there. Any reference I can provide to you if you ask me in an email. And the Plan Vivo's components, the interesting thing is they reflect the 3-dimensional habitat structure that is typical. And then the VERRA, Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard Nature Framework, that published by VERRA in 2024, they don't have a specific list of indicators, but they give guidance on selected what they call condition indicators for projects in the tropical and subtropical regions. They do not use phylogenetic diversity, which is something you would think about using, but and they don't use it as a composition indicator, and they don't use below ground biomass of plants either because of the difficulties in measurement and analysis. And now just contrasting 2 approaches, that is one, the Wallacea Trust approach to the right, on the right side of the slides, and on the bottom picture, there is an area where they are issuing biodiversity credits in the UK. They quantify overall biodiversity. So it's a basket of indicators, all types of indicators. And one biodiversity credit corresponds to 1% of uplift of or avoided loss per hectare. And it's very many different types of indicators that they're using, their components, a peer review system, very strict, but as far as I know, they are not selling biodiversity credits yet. And the Rausing Protocol version 4 in Colombia, as you know, they have the developed methods to quantify positive contributions in at least 1 hectare for their habitat banks. They are now called TEBUs, or Terrazos Biodiversity Units, for a duration of 30 years. And the first of all was Bosque de Niebla, the top picture there that you have seen probably many times now, because it was a pioneer effort. It was the first time ever a biodiversity credit was issued in Latin America and in the world, Bosque de Niebla, or cloud forest, in Antioquia, and selling in the open market for about $25 per hectare, and the websites are there if you want to check the information there. So this is the next part of my presentation today. The work that we did exactly on this, monitoring and verification of components for biodiversity credits, as a consultant job with Terrazos, part of last year and part of this year as well. the whole idea was to strengthen the biodiversity monitoring in habitat banks that they already had in their protocols. The leaders, I was the leader myself, and then several master students at our school, and several graduate students of our school, and also faculty of our school who have been involved or are still involved. And then from we have worldwide collaborators, the National University of Misiones in Argentina, and Aves Argentinas, which is an NGO in Misiones and Paraguay. And those are our international collaborators. So Terrazos, their habitat bank, they ask us to focus, they have several habitat banks, but they ask us to focus our efforts in Mata de Lata. It's a tropical dry forest in Valledupar, in the Cesar department of Colombia. The whole objective of the Habitat Bank is the restoration and conservation of tropical dry forests in this particular case, but that's because you know that tropical dry forests are one of the most endangered ecosystems in Colombia and in Latin America and other parts of the world. So they issue biodiversity credits for each of their habitat banks or TEBUs, and 1 hectare is 1 credit, and to assign the value of those credits, they take into consideration the costs associated with issuing biodiversity credits. You have to choose an area and then think what you're going to do, restoration, you're going to be fencing the area, you need perhaps to do a land lease, you need transportation, there are costs of monitoring, there is local capacity development, which is very important because there are people living there or taking care of it, insurance, taxes, communications, etc. So that's how they determine the cost for the biodiversity credits that they're issuing. And in their protocol, they have the standards that we put them here in this table to show you what are the different standards that they were focusing at the time they started the work with us, or at the time we started working for them. So the goal is always that the degraded or areas that are in the habitat bank are recovered, and then there is an increase in biodiversity. But then what are the different components? The components are, for example, what you see in this table, vegetation and fauna. So 2 components, vegetation and fauna. For each, what are the variables that are measured? Composition and structure, and function, composition and structure, and for the animals, the threat that they are under. So those are the criteria. Then the indicators are all the kinds of things that you can measure. You can get diversity, units of measurements, maybe biodiversity indices of all types. In terms of biomass, could be for vegetation, the composition for the animals, and so far. So we took this protocol, and then we said, okay, so here are our suggestions or recommendations. So our recommendations started by adding a main new component, which is the soils. That's why I put this table here on the left side where it says soil microbes. So that's the component, soil microbes, suggesting to use environmental DNA. And why? Because that's a relatively simple measurement to sample it. And then there are many laboratories available in Colombia, same as they are in many countries of the world, to do the analysis, the chemical analysis, the extraction that has to be done, and the interpretation, and the frequency for each of the measurements, 5-year monitoring, for example, and how to collect it. And we give detail, the specificity of everything, how to take the samples, etc. So this table, we have it for this innovation that we asked them to do, but then we have tables for other things, improvements on other components that they are already monitoring, improvements or suggestions for each. For example, here you have on the bottom part 2 pictures of the vegetation coverage, so the plots, and then at different heights using drones, and then the orthomosaic that is there, how it can be interpreted. So other tables will show different components and different suggestions for each. For example, here we have vegetation monitoring strategy, and then we have in each column the different technologies. So we have suggestions for improving the use of drones, although they're already using them. or as you call them, untripulated aerial vehicles, satellite remote sensing, LiDAR and radar, and then the field sampling measuring trees, DVH, marking trees, etc. There are suggestions for improving or changing the way they are doing each of the things, for the frequency and for the data analysis, how to conduct it. Birds and bats, so those are key because birds and bats are excellent indicators. So bioacoustic, mist nets, and point counts were the three methodologies that we recommended for them that they were already using, but we're recommending some changes for each of them. As you see in the left side is bioacoustics, mist nets and harp traps, and the point counts, and they the recommendations are both for birds and for harp traps. An interesting thing is here we're showing, we did a pilot. Two of our team went to Mata de Lata, to Colombia, and spent some time there demonstrating the use of the technology. There you can see on the right side the bioacoustic recorded from Frontier Labs that and then you see Jorge, the leader there, setting up the recording on the top. And that's so delicate. Those recorders have to be set in a Tupperware or something to protect them against the water. There are many details related to recommendations on how to use them. And then we used two bioacoustic recorders, Frontier Lab, the one that you see in the picture, and then I have my own I can show you here. That's a little one I use at home. But we also used AudioMoth that Terrazas already had, and that's very much used all over the place because they're less expensive than the Frontier Lab. So these are the things that you have to take into consideration, the cost-benefit analysis. Then the details are what it says there. You need to pre-program. You need to know how many the intervals that you want them to take pictures to capture the activity of the bird. So that influences a lot what type of animal, or in the case of the birds, you're going to be able to detect. And then the different types of programming can influence a lot. And then you need to know how to interpret the spectrogram that you get from these devices. So the acoustic recordings, which is what you see there, the BirdNet spectrogram, they were analyzed using BirdNet version 2.4. And there are different ways of interpreting these spectrograms. But that's the key. How do you interpret them? How do you know who is who in this nice spectrogram? So there is a reference there by Botan collaborator on how to interpret the BirdNet spectrogram. And BirdNet is a freely available tool, and there may be other tools out there that's put by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And we use the default parameter values, but again, that's something that you have to use your own judgment on how to interpret the spectrograms. Mammals, large and small mammals, camera traps, drones, and DNA. You see here the pictures of our team discussing drone trajectories. That's one of the key aspects. You need to know what to do, how to do. You need to have expertise on flying the drones, and you need to have a license depending on the countries. That varies. And then traps, camera traps can vary. And you see those designs were taken to the field by our team. So that's very interesting. And then the frequencies and all that, those are important things. So as you see, then summarizing all this, there are techniques that are available for monitoring biodiversity gains for the components that are selected for each target ecosystem. So you need to first choose the components and technologies, depending on objectives, target species, ecosystems, of course, and the cost-benefit analysis that I just told you about. The eDNA sampling, for example, doesn't require high expertise to take the sample, but there are companies that have to process that, and those are high cost per sample. So that goes into your cost-benefit analysis. And sometimes you need more than one technique, or I would say most of the time, because if DNA is too costly, you need to use something else. And then the drones may be not practical or or LiDAR and everything in regions of the world where forests are not well known, so you don't know the species composition. So how can you relate what you see from the image that you get from the drone or from the radar to the actual species composition? Sometimes the agreement is only like 50%. It's not too good. So all that is very important. So that's why you need the human expertise for the ground truth monitoring. You need to really know what's there. You cannot put enough emphasis on the human expertise that is needed. That's why on the top there is a picture and people are there with some training, because local capacities have to be developed for that. And then luckily we see there is so much interest in all this that the human and technical capabilities are supposed to increase in the coming decades. We already see a real big increase, so especially, for example, in the audio, acoustic monitoring, but that's changing as we speak. The other key thing is third-party monitoring standards. That's a key for integrity. How do you know if you are a buyer, if you are the market person? How do you know that this is really true, that you are seeing a biodiversity gain if you are the same one who is doing the baseline and then the increase, the same person who are involved. So third-party monitoring is a key aspect, and you know that region network does it. It may be others offer that service, may be very expensive, and then you need to know that there have to be standards. How do you know the standards are there? And there was a discussion the other day in a session organized by Region Network. How do you know, really? So I think a lot of emphasis was put on the human training, and then the local context too, because something that you use for Latin America, how can you extrapolate that to do it in Africa if you're a third-party monitoring person? So the interesting thing is that projects with C4, you know, the Center for International Forestry Research in Indonesia, and you know, Natural State, naturalstate.org, they have developed technologies for impact monitoring, so that's key. They have developed models using AI, machine training for the methodologies for the third party verifying, and their idea is to issue, they haven't issued yet, not many, integrating carbon and biodiversity impacts, the two of them together. So that's what you call a high quality credit, integrating both. So then this whole idea comes from the idea that that both sustainable forestry and agroforestry can function as biodiversity islands in human-dominated landscapes that, you know, they are going to increase in size as we go in our world, in our planet. So, but not all sustainable forestry and agroforestry are biodiversity friendly. It depends very much on design, species, and management. So there is greater potential for multi-strata agroforestry with perennial crops like cacao, yerba mate, coffee, etc., where there is already a background of existing payments for environmental services programs in many parts. There are seals, like the Rainforest Alliance has seals for biodiversity-friendly coffee, certification in many cases. So that shows that there is an interest in valuing biodiversity and compensating the farmers for that. So that gives you the idea that that can be done also with biodiversity credits, then expanding their scope. But you need to be careful, because not all, as I said, not all what's called biodiversity friendly is biodiversity friendly. So you have to be very careful on how you monitor that. So I think part of the monitoring will have to do with the real species and management that's done in the specific places. We have ongoing collaboration in Brazil, in Ecuador with cacao agroforestry systems, and in Argentina, as I mentioned, with yerba mate agroforestry. So this is the final slide. We can say as key messages that what are biodiversity credits, measurable certificates, evidence-based, meaning the scientific aspect of it, of positive biodiversity outcomes, durable, same as in carbon, isn't it? And additional to the situation without intervention, many similarities between the carbon market and the biodiversity credit market. One is learning from the other one. A biodiversity outcome, what it is, the difference between the scenario with project activities and the baseline, and because that's measured, the credit reflects an improvement. And then the key parameters, remember this, and metrics for monitoring biodiversity must be context dependent. You cannot apply the same one all over the place as much as you would like. Current initiatives are developing worldwide with focus on habitat banks, umbrella species, indigenous people, local communities, most based on natural landscapes, but they can also serve to promote biodiversity-friendly sustainable land uses like sustainable forestry, agriculture, agroforestry, and they can complement other incentives because there are already existing incentives, government incentives, all kinds of prices, higher prices for certified products, but they can complement and then help promote these sustainable and biodiversity-friendly land uses. But remember, they depend on design and management with more complex agroforestry such as multi-strata, permanent crops and home gardens having more biodiversity than simply designs. The pictures on the right side are from Ecuador and from the US too. So thank you for your attention. We want to acknowledge the funding and support that we had for a couple of years now from the Yale School of the Environment, the Yale Women Faculty Forum from Yale too, very important in funding, the consultancy with Terrazos that funded some of this research, my own research program that gets money from here and there, and Springer Publishers that publish the 2 books that are out there on top on biodiversity islands, on an agroforestry, and then the one that's coming out soon. We're already starting on promoting agroforestry for biodiversity restoration in human-dominated landscapes, potential of biodiversity credits as financial incentives, and our website is there, along with the logos of our collaborators, the School of Forest Science of the National University of Misiones, and the NGO Aves Argentinas, or Argentine Birds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florencia. And as Fred wrote in the chat, if you missed the second webinar in this series, one of the panelists was actually Mariana Sarmiento, who's the CEO of Terrazos, and she shared the company's overall work in Colombia. So feel free to check that out. That presentation is on YouTube. So we can move into our next speaker today, who is Dr. Toral Shah, the Biodiversity Coordinator at Plan Vivo. She recently completed a PhD in Life Sciences with the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and Imperial College London. She conducted in-depth fieldwork in Tanzania to better understand the poorly known taxa, ecology, threats, and conservation status of the plant family Ochnaceae, and particularly the genus Ochna. Prior to this, she worked as a curator botanist at Kew Gardens. She holds a Master of Science in Plant Diversity from the University of Reading, where her research focused on assessing the conservation status through indicator species in the Chimanimani Mountains of Mozambique. Toral was born in Kenya and is passionate about conservation, particularly in Africa. Toral, if you'd like to unmute and say hello to everyone, you're welcome to do so.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Sophie. And yeah, pleasure to be here. And I hope it definitely echo Florencia's comments. This is a very fast evolving space, and keen and excited to share the work that Plan Vivo is doing in the emerging biodiversity credit market, and look forward to having some questions and answers at the end. Thanks. Everyone, my name is Toral. I'm the Biodiversity Coordinator at the Plan Vivo Foundation. Today I'm going to be talking about the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, which is called PV Nature, and showcasing how it's an opportunity to deliver impact for nature, climate, and people through inclusive nature-based solutions. So for those who are not familiar with Plan Vivo is a charitable foundation with over 25 years of experience supporting smallholder farmers and climate-sensitive communities across the world to develop sustainable land use projects. This has primarily been through the voluntary carbon market, where we operate the Plan Vivo Carbon Standard. Today, we operate 2 standards, the carbon standard called PV Climate, and the new, more recently launched, the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard called PV Nature. Both these Standards operate to put smallholders and communities at the center of a project design through participatory approaches in the implementation and the operation of the project. So over the last 25 years, projects that are certified under the Plan Vivo carbon standard have delivered significant impact. Namely, over 8 million tons of carbon dioxide has been removed from the environment. Over 270,000 hectares of land are currently under sustainable management, and over $34 million has been generated and directed back towards communities. More recently, we've been trying to expand our reach through the development of the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, known as PV Nature, by building on this model and the values and experiences gained through our carbon certified projects, especially in recognition of the increased biodiversity loss across the world and its impact particularly on climate sensitive communities. So we want to learn from and build synergies between the emerging biodiversity market and the existing voluntary carbon market by ensuring newly generated biodiversity certificates or credits are generated through high integrity with associated claims that are credible and issued through credible standards and mechanisms. The Plan Vivo model ensures all projects are holistic so that we are generating impacts that strengthen and build resilience not just only in nature but also for people and climate. We want to ensure that the projects are transparent and accountable, particularly around how benefits are shared equally with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Under the Plan Vivo standards, we have a requirement that at least a minimum of 60% revenue from the sale of the certificates are directed back to the hands of the communities, and that we're generating real and robust verifiable outcomes for biodiversity that are really accelerating progress towards our global goals for nature recovery. And this model, as I said in my previous slide, is based on 25 years of experience with community-led projects in the voluntary carbon market. Under the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, there are key project requirements that all projects must apply. And the first is around land rights, ensuring that management and land rights for the project area are held by members of the community exclusively. And only up to 30% can be managed by an outside entity. Then there are requirements around land management, and this is where the participatory approach comes in. Participants have the right to manage the project area for the duration of the project, and this should be proven by land tenure or customary land tenure or binding agreements between land owners and participants. And finally is around the nature-based approach. So project activities should be centered around either restoration, conservation, or improved land management. In addition to the broad themes around the project requirements I previously mentioned, there are other requirements that projects must follow. You can check them out in our project requirements document on our website, and you can see some of the areas additionally that projects need to apply within the project design, namely those around stakeholder engagement, applying free, prior, informed consent, having a realistic theory of change, ensuring the benefit sharing mechanism is fair and equitable, and then there are other requirements around monitoring biodiversity and ensuring those outcomes have been validated by third parties. I wanted to include a short note on high integrity outcomes. Before we began our work in the biodiversity market space, we conducted an exercise to outline some key high-level principles for the emerging biodiversity market, really ensuring that holistic approach, transparency, and that outcomes are real, additional, and verified for biodiversity, people, and climate. Importantly, for Plan Vivo, the biodiversity standard is not to be used for offsets, but rather to incentivize sustainable land use. And we want to ensure alignment with larger global initiatives such as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We are also closely aligned with the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity Credits Framework for High Integrity Biodiversity Credit Markets, which was developed in conjunction with the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and the World Economic Forum. So the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, this is a certification to enable the issuance of biodiversity certificates, or also known as biodiversity credits. It's a mechanism to channel responsible finance towards indigenous peoples and local communities so that we can mobilize resources and also incentivize the restoration and conservation of biodiversity. The development of this standard was not done alone. There was a long process behind this work. We started with a lot of scoping and discussions, including 2 core working groups. We had input from the ground through pilot projects and launch projects. We received feedback from the wider community through public consultations and technical reviews, and we had lots of partners and collaborations with different organizations supporting us throughout the work. Of course, this needs to be aligned with larger initiatives, and I already mentioned the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, World Economic Forum, and the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity Credits as just some of those. So now I'm going to talk about how we quantify trends in biodiversity. I'm not going into the details of the technical aspects of our methodology, but more outlining the broader principles and the choices behind our methodological approach. So how do we quantify trends in biodiversity? In general, the scope of the methodology ensures that the certificates generated through the standard represent positive outcomes for biodiversity that have been generated within a project area. Importantly, the methodology describes the effort required to quantify biodiversity impact in a standardized way, removing on-the-ground level bias. However, it's not intended to be the entirety of the monitoring that any project can undertake if they wish, which contribute further to the value and the story behind the project rather than the way the credits are calculated. So on the PV nature, there are 2 project types. The first is either a conservation project or secondly, a restoration project. If a project wishes to be certified under conservation, there is an eligibility criteria where the project must demonstrate that the project area meets at least 1 key biodiversity area criteria or 2 important plant area criteria. And this is really to ensure that the conservation project is indeed protecting areas of existing high biodiversity value. If the project does not meet these criteria, then this falls under a restoration project where the project is restoring previously degraded areas of biodiversity. Note that the eligibility criteria around key biodiversity areas or important plant areas does not mean that the project needs to be designated as a key biodiversity area or important plant area. However, they need to trigger 1 or 2 criteria respectively. So some of the key choices behind the PV Nature methodology ensure that members of the community can directly engage with the monitoring of biodiversity, that over time the approach becomes scalable and feasible, and that the data can be audited independently by third parties. We want to ensure that we have an approach that produces evidence-based outcomes, and that the results are repeatable and comparable over time, minimizing any opportunities to game or cheat the system. And as I've mentioned, there are 2 project types, either those that are conserving areas with existing high biodiversity value or restoration projects restoring areas that have been previously degraded. Some cases have both conservation and restoration interventions within one project area. So how is biodiversity impact measured under PV Nature? Projects measure change in species data combined with habitat data. This is looking at broad taxonomic groups for the species such as birds, plants, bats, etc., combined with habitat data looking at land use and habitat quality and connectivity. The data is collected by projects annually using digital recorders such as camera traps, acoustic monitors, satellite imagery, and other digital tools, which allow an auditable and digital trace of the data. For the data analysis, this is done by machine learning and combined with human expert annotation, where tested expertise for the species and habitat are included in the analysis. In general, the approach is not meant to measure every single organism within a project area, but track general trends in ecosystem health over time. And the unit we are working with is a percentage change per hectare per year, or in conservation projects, percentage no change per hectare per year. So the core monitoring principles for the biodiversity methodology include covering sufficient taxonomic breadth. So for terrestrial projects, this includes a minimum of 4 target groups. Minimum requirements include bats and low-lying plants below 2 meters, and then additional groups are selected based on the ecosystem preferences. For marine, this is still a work in progress, but we are looking at including benthing vegetation and or sessile invertebrates, as well as fish. And then another 2 taxonomic groups are included based on the ecoregional context. As I said, the data is collected digitally, ensuring that we have spatial and temporal metadata associated to the data collection, and that the sampling is done through a random stratified sampling approach based on habitat stratification. So the methodology looks at 5 core metrics. These are known as pillar metrics. The first 3 are around species data, looking at species richness, species diversity, taxonomic dissimilarity, followed by 2 metrics looking at habitat, including habitat health and habitat spatial structure. The 5th metric is only measured every 5 years. The 5 pillar metrics are combined, aggregated using a cumulative sum to form a single unit known as the multi-metric, which equals a percentage change per hectare per year. This value is then converted into the number of certificates that gets issued by Plan Vivo, providing the project is in conformance with the rest of the standard. So here are the 5 pillar metrics presented in further detail. I won't cover this now due to time, but you can read more about them on our website, on our documentation page, particularly around the methodology. So what do projects get? Projects are issued with Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates. 1 PVBC equals evidence-based outcomes for biodiversity, climate, and communities that have been additional and verified over time. Each certificate represents a 1% change per hectare per year, and this is measured annually and issued annually. So how do projects become certified under PV Nature? They need to demonstrate additionality through a barrier analysis, including accounting for threats in the project area. They need to demonstrate realistic theory of change over time, including a project logic that lasts for 25 years, of course, including adaptive management plans. And they also need to have sufficient capacity to conduct detailed community engagement and stakeholder consultations over time. You can see below there is a flow diagram for the pathway towards issuing Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates. There are several stages of documentation and review, including by the Secretariat, an independent technical review panel, and also third-party validation and verification periodically. And finally, just to end on the pipeline of emerging PV Nature projects, some of which are listed on this slide here. We have a mix of terrestrial and marine projects. You can check them out on our pipeline page on our website. And if you want to learn more about any of these projects, please get in contact with us. And with that, thank you for listening. If you do have any more questions, don't hesitate to contact us or scan the QR code to learn more about PV Nature. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Toral, for that presentation. We do have a few questions. I see that some have already been answered, which is great, but I'll just jump in with a few that haven't been answered yet. And I guess we can leave it to either of you, depending on if you feel like you have anything to add. So for our first question, how do you assess improvement of the habitat without a control site, or is there a control site? And I think this is something that comes up with carbon crediting baselines too. And so it's an important point, you know, is there an outside site that we're comparing against? So Florencia or Toral, if either of you want to take a stab at this one, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Toral. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can try give this one a go to start. So for Plan Vivo, we don't use control sites primarily because of some of the issues and complexities around looking for suitable reference sites or control sites relative to that ecosystem. It also adds an additional burden on the project or the proponent in terms of monitoring the control site on top of the project area. So instead, we opted for measuring biodiversity relative to the baseline over time. And in terms of conservation projects in which control sites are often used, for example, in red, we use that eligibility requirement around key biodiversity areas or important plant areas where projects need to demonstrate that they are protecting areas of existing high biodiversity value.
Thank you. Anything to add, Florencia?
No, I was about to answer something similar, that in many areas where biodiversity credit schemes are being established, the complexity of the habitats is so great that it's almost impossible to find a reference. And that's very, I would say it's common to almost any biological study of natural ecosystems. There are like different approaches depending on what you want to really assess. If you want to assess productivity of something and you are managing for productivity or something like that, you definitely have to have a control of some type because you apply or you don't apply the measure, for example. But in cases when you want to know what's there, which is essentially what you want for biodiversity credits schemes, you want to know how much biodiversity is here now and how much biodiversity will be in the future, is going to be later when you assess the biodiversity change. That's what. So you don't really need the control because you are doing the comparison over time. So those are different approaches for doing science in biological systems according to the objectives. So I would say for biodiversity credits, it's not really needed because you are not applying different you don't want to demonstrate that if you don't manage the area, the biodiversity will decrease. No, that's not an experiment you want to do. So it's totally okay not to use controls in this case.
Makes sense. Thank you. We also have a couple questions related to the demand. Someone's asking about the demand for PV nature biodiversity credits, and another person is asking, who can get involved in pursuing these credits? And I think it's an interesting point because, Toral, you mentioned that Plan Vivo doesn't do offsets. So what are the kinds of incentives and who is looking to purchase these credits?
Yeah, so this is a good question. The demand side for biodiversity, voluntary biodiversity credits is still emerging. Lots of businesses and companies are still trying to understand their own impacts and impacts on biodiversity and nature based on their own value chains, their own operations. And so what we are understanding from the current market position is that as these businesses are understanding where to deliver or mitigate their impacts in line with mitigation hierarchy, is where then biodiversity credits comes in. So after businesses have already dealt with dealing and restoring and repairing their own impacts, then they have the opportunity to start targeting nature positive and buying voluntary biodiversity credits. So at the moment, the demand for biodiversity credits at Plan Vivo is still quite limited because we are at a very developmental stage. Our projects are just starting to move into operation and development. For Plan Vivo, that means a lot of engagement with local communities and really getting that project off the ground. This then allows them to design their sort of financial model, understand type of biodiversity impact they will have over time, whether that's conservation or restoration impact, and then target the right buyers for the right type of certificates or impact that they are delivering. This may vary whether it's marine, terrestrial, or different types of project interventions. So the Plan Vivo don't get involved in any sort of selling or buying mechanism. We are simply the certifier, and our projects directly engage with market actors to sell these certificates. But as I said, this is still at an early stage. We are at a development stage rather than an issuance stage. Our projects will issue certificates after being operational for more than 2 years. So after having at least 2 years data collection in addition to baseline. because we know biodiversity data and biodiversity change is quite variable, it's fluctuant, and it's influenced by so many factors, that we want to have enough data points to be able to create more reliable assumptions on what change is actually happening on the ground. And so we have designed this process to have that sort of lag time between registration or certification and issuance. So this doesn't mean projects can't engage with buyers or investors prior with that intention to either set up agreements or pre-purchase deals where they will be able to forecast with the baseline data how much change that they may expect. So yeah, as I said, it's a work in progress. It's a moving target when it comes to biodiversity monitoring, but we hope to see some increase in demand as these projects actually get off the ground in the coming months.
Yeah,
I could add that that was a hot question last week when the subject of the webinar was exactly markets, and there were not opposing, but there was some controversy during the webinar. And I remember one of the speakers was saying that the market is someone buys, someone sells, and the buyer has to know if to be interested, they have to know if there is a profit. So that way it kills it because it's a very narrow, to me, in my opinion, it's a very narrow look at the market. The market is not just that, to buy to get a profit. And there is also philanthropy, for example, which is a big source of money. And you don't call it a market because it's not really a market. But what's the problem, in my opinion, if all the biodiversity credits of the world are bought by philanthropy? More than welcome. So I think the focus has to go beyond who buys and who sells, and I'm going to get a profit or not. I'm a company. I need to show my investors that it has to be broader than that. We have many examples of that already that have to do with biodiversity credits, because it's not just selling the biodiversity credit to some, oh, you'll get rich by buying that. No, that's not the case. The case is making the private investors have a role in protecting nature, which is much broader than just, for example, many governments have a commitment and they have to show it because there are international agreements. There are all kinds of targets, year 2030, so many hectares, all those things. The different countries have to set their targets because they are asked by the international community. And same happens with the private companies. There are many private companies in the world that have to show to their investors that they are doing green investment or something like that, whatever you want to call it. Otherwise, they'll stop buying their so that's why. So if I stop investing in Bank of America because I say, oh, they're all only investing in mining company, then that's bad for them. So there are many companies in the world, and I know I'm saying that almost as a joke, but it's not a joke. It's very true. I know many companies, many banks actually in India and other places that need to show to their investors that they are investing in things like biodiversity. Otherwise, they are going to lose. So people are wiser than just looking at how much money they will get in 10 years. No, they're looking at the future too. So that's very important. Making what we want to think is a little bit more holistically, as you are thinking, because another thing that's very, very important is the holistic approach that you are talking about, involving communities, because there are all these it's not side benefits. There are benefits that are included in getting biodiversity gains, which are the benefits for communities, and then getting away from this third-party monitoring, because you are training the communities on how to do their own monitoring. So there you are. So you have to think broader about the market. That's my message there.
Yeah, we do have community-led monitoring, but we do use third parties for various additional aspects of the certification process. And I think that's part of the role of a standard setter like Plan Vivo provides or facilitates the separation of different roles within the certification process. And For us, we have that at third-party verification, so validation verification, so that's auditing of the results and the outcomes over time. But we also have an additional third-party role where we do data analysis. So the calculation of the credits is actually conducted by third parties. And this, this removes any potential proponent bias, but also removes the very high level required expertise from the projects to do data analysis, which has been a bottleneck or a capacity restriction for many carbon projects, specifically community-led carbon projects. And we want to be able to alleviate this pressure and also create a high integrity approach to how, or standardized approach to how credits are calculated.
Great. Thank you so much for your input on that. I think given that we only have a couple of minutes left until 10, we'll have to wrap it up there and leave the rest of the time for announcements. But thank you so much for both of your presentations. It was wonderful to hear about the work that Plan Vivo is doing. And Florencia, thank you so much for sharing. So I will hand it back over to Fred now, I believe, for closing announcements.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks to our panelists and our audience for a wonderful Q&A. We would like to close with a few announcements. Admissions for our Tropical Forest Landscapes online certificate program is still open and is open until April 28th. So if you are still applying, we encourage you to submit your application on time. And if you have any questions, you can visit our website or email us at tropicalcertificate@yale.edu. We encourage you to visit our events page on our website and subscribe to our mailing list to receive notifications on our upcoming events. We have a list of events coming up, so please do subscribe to receive notifications. Again, we remind you that all our sessions are being recorded and they are available on our YouTube channel, so please visit the channel to view if you want to go back, and you can also recommend to your colleagues if they missed the session for them to get access to the videos. Finally, on behalf of the webinar planning team, I would like to extend our utmost gratitude to Dr. Florencia Montagnini and Dr. David Myers for helping us identify speakers for this series. And also a big thank you to Sophie and all other moderators for helping us with the webinars. Finally, visit our website or send us an email for more information. Thank you and take care, and see you in our next series.